Running the overseas provinces has become extremely expensive. Parliament announces that for the first time, the Americans will pay a small tax, not to their local legislatures, but directly to England.
I think that's the first thing that one has to say, looking back on it, seeing now, as we must do, that this was the opening of something which was going to be very big and very important, is that nobody realised that at the time. The British government had a variety of bits of legislation in hand, dealing with a variety of problems, as governments do. This was one of them, a moderately prominent piece of legislative programme of 1765, tidying up various details of the administration of colonies, but it wasn't really a subject of vast interest. It was rather technical. It was extremely remote. If you had stopped the average man in the street and said, "What do you think about the Stamp Act, my man?" He would have said, "What?"
It is called the Stamp Act because taxed items will have to carry a stamp, paid for by the user. Test pressings are made, and the new tax is set to go into effect in the fall. It takes 6 weeks by sailing ship for news of the tax to cross the ocean. When it arrives, the news creates a firestorm up and down the continent. For the colonial elite, the men who run the local legislatures, the Stamp Act is an outrage. It seems to confirm their worst suspicions, that they are not respected in England, not worth even being consulted about this change in policy. George Washington is a delegate sitting in the Virginia legislature.
The Stamp Act, imposed on the colonies by the Parliament of Great Britain, is an ill-judged measure. Parliament has no right to put its hands into our pockets without our consent.
Even royal appointees like the highly regarded Thomas Hutchinson, Chief Justice of Massachusetts, are upset.
You must not deprive the colonies of their right to make laws for themselves. Parliament should only make laws necessary for the empire as a whole.
The larger meaning of their life was wrapped up in being Britons. They were proud not to be Dutch, not to be French, not to be Spanish colonists, but to be British colonists, and to have, for 150 years, taxed themselves, governed themselves, behaved just like independent Englishmen did, although they were living in America. Now suddenly the Stamp Act implied that they were going to be governed, taxed by a parliament a long way away in which they had no representatives. Now, the only people who were taxed without their consent in Britain were servants, people who didn't have any property, women, children. And so the Stamp Act seemed to Americans to reduce Americans to the same status as servants and women and all those dependent people who were civilly emasculated. That is, they didn't have any public role in their own governance.
George Washington and other colonial leaders clearly see what will become of them unless they take action.
A line should be drawn between Great Britain and the colonies, clearly establishing our rights. We must either assert our rights or submit and become tame and abject slaves, like the Negroes over whom we rule with such arbitrary sway.
This tax is going to touch everyone. It's probably one of the dumbest political acts in the history of government. They tax dice and cards. So the rowdiest group of people there are in the world, sailors in port with nothing to do, are going to be angry. They tax legal documents, which means that lawyers, the most articulate and argumentative people in America, are up in arms also.
If the stamp man tells you to kiss his ass, shall he get away with it and live? Don't let your courage cool, or a few bullies scare you. We've nothing to fear but slavery. Love your liberty and fight for it like men who know its value. Once lost, it will never, never be regained.